The rain pounded against the cracked pavement as Olivia pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her hands trembling from more than just the cold, her mind still replaying the last words she had screamed at her mother before slamming the door behind her 2 months ago, words she wished she could take back but couldn't, words that still hung between them like an open wound. She had sworn she wouldn't care, that she wouldn't look back, that she was better off alone, but now standing here in the flickering fluorescent light of a near-empty bus station at the edge of town, she couldn't stop her heart from lurching as she saw her mother sitting on the hard plastic bench, her hair damp, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield, staring at the ground as if the weight of something unbearable had finally crushed her. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, an invisible force pushing and pulling her all at once. She wanted to turn away, pretend she hadn't seen, pretend she didn't care. But her feet refused to move, and then, too late, her mother lifted her head, their eyes locking like a snap of thunder, a collision of emotions neither of them were ready for: surprise, pain, anger, something deeper, something unspoken, the space between them both infinite and suffocatingly close. Olivia saw the flicker of hesitation in her mother's gaze, the way her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. And she hated it, hated the way it made her feel like a child again, small and uncertain and desperate for something she couldn't name. The silence stretched unbearably long until her mother finally broke it, her voice rough, tired, careful. Olivia, just her name, nothing else. And yet it cracked something inside her, her pulse hammering in her ears, memories crashing in like waves, late nights curled up together under warm blankets, whispered secrets, laughter that had once felt like home. And then the shouting, the slammed doors, the accusations that cut too deep, the feeling of not being enough, of wanting to run, but also wanting to be held. And now here they were, two people who once belonged to each other now standing on opposite sides of something they didn't know how to cross. Olivia swallowed hard, tasting salt, not sure if it was from the rain or something else, her hands clenching into fists at her sides as she forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Her mother blinked, something unreadable flickering across her face before she exhaled, shaking her head slightly as if she wasn't sure of the answer herself. And then, just as Olivia took a hesitant step forward, something shattered. A distant scream, a crash, the sharp screech of tires, both of them turning at once toward the street outside, toward the chaos unfolding beyond the glass doors. And suddenly none of it mattered anymore, not the fight, not the words, not the time lost. Only the unspoken instinct to move, to react, to reach for each other as the world around them twisted into something neither of them could have expected. The sound of the crash seemed to freeze time for a split second before chaos erupted all around them, the distant scream turning into a chorus of shouts and panicked voices as people rushed toward the shattered remains of what had once been a stoplight now crumpled against the hood of a car, its flickering red glow reflecting in the pools of rainwater collecting on the pavement. Olivia's breath hitched as she watched the scene unfold. But before she could even process what she was seeing, she felt a hand close around her wrist, warm, familiar, urgent. Her mother, pulling her back toward the wall of the bus station, shielding her from the confusion outside. And for a second Olivia almost let herself lean into the touch, almost forgot everything that had led them to this moment. But then she pulled away, shaking off the grip with a sharpness that made her mother flinch, the air between them thick again, heavy with all the things they couldn't say. "I don't need your help" was on the tip of Olivia's tongue, but she swallowed it down, because even as she wanted to push her mother away, something deep inside her was screaming at her to hold on, to not let this be the end. But before she could say anything, the wail of sirens sliced through the night, blue and red lights flashing across the wet pavement as an ambulance and 2 police cars skidded to a halt near the wreckage, paramedics rushing out, their voices firm but calm as they assessed the situation. The wrecked car's driver slumped forward over the wheel, unmoving. Olivia's stomach twisted as she took a step forward, drawn by some invisible force. But her mother caught her wrist again, gentler this time, her grip firm yet cautious. "You don't need to see this," she murmured, and Olivia wanted to snap back, wanted to say, "I'm not a child." But the words never came because the way her mother was looking at her, like she was something fragile, something worth protecting, made her feel unsteady, like she was teetering on the edge of something she didn't understand. And suddenly, she hated that she had missed her, hated that after all this time she still wanted to collapse into her arms and let herself be small just for a moment. But instead, she clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus on the scene before them, forcing herself to keep her distance, because if she let her mother in now, it would hurt too much when she inevitably left again, the way she always did, the way she had the night they fought. But before she could spiral further, something shifted in the air, a change in the tone of the voices near the crash, a paramedic waving over an officer, his expression grim, urgent. Olivia didn't know why, but a cold dread crept up her spine. Something about this felt wrong, too familiar. Her mother must have felt it too, because she exhaled sharply, stepping closer to the curb, her body tense. Olivia had never seen her mother afraid, not like this, not with this kind of quiet, restrained panic. It sent a chill through her bones, and then she heard it, one of the officers speaking in a low voice into his radio. But Olivia caught the words anyway. They landed like a punch to the gut. The driver, female, approximately 40, no identification, unconscious but alive. Possible overdose. Olivia's breath caught, her pulse a hammer against her ribs. 40, unconscious, no ID. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But she turned anyway, her mother already pale as a ghost, her lips slightly parted, her entire body rigid with something Olivia didn't want to name, didn't want to believe, because there was no way that fate could be that cruel. But as her mother took a shaky step forward, Olivia knew before the words even left her lips, "That's my sister." Olivia's stomach dropped, a hollow, twisting sensation that made her knees weak as she turned to her mother, searching her face for some kind of denial, some sign that this was just a mistake. But the way her mother stood frozen, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling at her sides, told her everything. This was real. This was happening. And the woman in the car, the barely conscious driver surrounded by paramedics, was the very person her mother had spent years trying to forget. Olivia didn't know much about her mother's sister, only fragments of whispered conversations, half-finished stories told in frustration or exhaustion, a name she barely remembered hearing, someone who had disappeared from their lives long before Olivia was old enough to ask questions. And yet, despite knowing so little, she could feel the weight of her mother's grief pressing into the air between them, thick and suffocating. Her mother finally moved, stepping forward like she was in a trance, her gaze locked onto the wreckage as if she could will it into not being real. But the moment she took a step into the street, an officer lifted a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Ma'am, we need you to stay back for now," he said firmly. But Olivia could see the barely contained panic in her mother's eyes, the way she clenched and unclenched her fists like she was trying to hold herself together with sheer force of will. "That's my sister," she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard over the rain and sirens. But the officer's expression didn't change. "We understand, but right now, she's in critical condition. The paramedics need space to stabilize her. Do you know if she has any medical conditions? Any allergies?" The words felt distant, mechanical, like they belonged to someone else's tragedy, but her mother nodded stiffly. She struggled with addiction. For years. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Olivia watched as something shattered behind her eyes. She had never seen her mother like this, small, vulnerable, exposed. A paramedic shouted something, and suddenly, the back doors of the ambulance swung open, the rain-soaked scene illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. Olivia caught a glimpse of the woman inside, her face pale, her body unnaturally still, tubes already taped to her skin as the medics worked frantically. Olivia had imagined meeting long-lost family members before, But not like this. Not under blaring sirens. Not with the stench of burning rubber and gasoline filling the air. A lump formed in her throat as she forced herself to look away. "She needs to go to the hospital immediately," one of the paramedics called out, motioning to the driver. And before Olivia could even process it, her mother was already speaking. "I'm coming with her." The words were spoken with such finality that even the officer hesitated for a second before nodding. "You're listed as next of kin?" he asked, and her mother nodded without hesitation. But Olivia saw the way she clenched her jaw, the way she seemed to be barely holding herself upright. The officer stepped aside, and without another word, her mother climbed into the ambulance, her expression unreadable as she sat beside the unconscious woman. The door shut with a hollow thud, and Olivia was left standing in the rain, the sounds of the city dull and distant. She should have followed. Should have climbed in after her. But something held her in place, something cold and uncertain. Because in that moment, she realized she didn't just fear losing a stranger, she feared losing her mother all over again. And she wasn't sure if she could survive that twice. The ambulance peeled away into the rain-soaked streets, its sirens wailing into the night, and Olivia stood frozen on the sidewalk, drenched and trembling, watching as her mother disappeared into the blur of red and blue lights. She wanted to move, wanted to follow, but something heavy pressed against her chest, rooting her to the ground. The way her mother had looked at that woman, her long-lost sister, was different from any expression Olivia had ever seen on her before. It wasn't just fear or grief, it was something deeper, something tangled in years of unspoken pain. Olivia had spent her entire life believing her mother was the strongest person she knew, but in that moment, she had looked breakable, like a single wrong word could shatter her into a million pieces. She finally forced herself to move, her legs stiff as she trudged back toward the car, her soaked hoodie clinging to her skin. The driver's seat was still warm when she slid inside, gripping the steering wheel as if it could ground her. Her hand shook. She knew she should drive to the hospital, that she should be there, but part of her hesitated. Her mother had never spoken about her past, not really. Sure, Olivia had overheard things, caught glimpses of old wounds in the way her mother's voice hardened when certain topics came up, but she had never been given the full truth. And now, after tonight, she realized just how much she didn't know. Who was that woman? What had happened between them? Why had her mother walked away all those years ago? And most importantly, why did it feel like something was shifting between them? Something bigger than Olivia could understand. Her fingers curled tighter around the steering wheel. She needed answers. With a deep breath, she turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. The drive to the hospital was a blur of wet pavement and streaking headlights, her pulse thrumming in her ears the whole way there. By the time she pushed through the emergency room doors, her clothes dripping onto the pristine white floors, she spotted her mother in the waiting area, hunched over in one of the plastic chairs, elbows on her knees, head in her hands. For a moment, Olivia hesitated, watching her from a few feet away. Her mother looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything was finally too much to carry. Then, as if sensing her, her mother lifted her head, her tired eyes meeting Olivia's. "You came," she murmured, her voice thick raw. "Of course I came," Olivia said, stepping forward, sitting beside her. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, not quite unbearable. Her mother exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. "She's in surgery," she finally said. "They don't know if she'll make it." Her voice wavered, and Olivia, for the first time in years, saw something close to fear in her mother's eyes. Not fear of the situation, not fear of the unknown, but something more personal, fear of loss. Olivia swallowed. "I didn't even know you had a sister," she admitted. Her mother's breath hitched, and she leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling like she was trying to hold back whatever emotions threatened to spill over. "I never wanted you to," she whispered. "I thought if I didn't talk about her, If I pretended she didn't exist, maybe she wouldn't haunt me anymore." The word sent a shiver through Olivia. "What happened?" For a long moment, her mother didn't answer. Then, finally, she spoke. "She was my responsibility. I was the older one. I was supposed to take care of her. But she trailed off, pressing her lips together. "She made choices I couldn't save her from. And eventually, I stopped trying." Olivia studied her mother's face, the lines of exhaustion, the sadness buried deep. "And now?" Her mother let out a shaky breath. "Now she's here. And I don't know if I can fix what's broken between us." Olivia hesitated, then reached out, resting a hand over her mother's. "You don't have to do it alone." For the first time that night, her mother looked at her, really looked at her. And in her gaze, Olivia saw something she had never seen before. Vulnerability, regret, and maybe, just maybe, hope. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Olivia sat beside her mother, her fingers still resting lightly over hers, feeling the slight tremble in her touch. And for the first time in her life, she saw her mother as something more than just the unwavering, stubborn, guarded woman she had always known. She saw her as human, flawed and uncertain, someone who had carried the weight of an entire past Olivia had never been allowed to see. And now, sitting in the cold sterility of the hospital waiting room, she realized just how much of that weight had been crushing her mother all these years. The silence between them was thick, filled with things neither of them knew how to say. But Olivia wasn't sure words were even enough. She had spent so long believing her mother didn't need anyone, that she had built herself into something unbreakable. But now, watching her sit there, her shoulders hunched, her expression a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, something like sorrow, Olivia understood that no one is unbreakable, no matter how much they try to be. Her mother exhaled, a slow, shaky breath, rubbing her temples before finally speaking, her voice low, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to be heard. "I should have done more," she said, her fingers curling slightly against her lap. "I should have tried harder to stop her before it got this far." Olivia hesitated, because she didn't even know the full story yet, didn't know what her mother had been trying to stop or why she had walked away. But something about the way she spoke, the guilt laced in every word, made Olivia's chest tighten. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice careful. Her mother let out a slow breath, her gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. And for a moment, Olivia thought she wasn't going to answer, but then, finally, she did. "She got involved with people she shouldn't have. She trusted the wrong person, and I let her. I thought if I warned her enough, if I told her what would happen, she'd listen, but she didn't. And when everything fell apart, I left. I walked away because I couldn't keep watching her destroy herself." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, a sound so unfamiliar that Olivia almost flinched, because she had never heard her mother sound like that before. So raw, so broken. Olivia swallowed, trying to process it, trying to understand the weight of everything her mother had just confessed. "But now she's here," Olivia said carefully, watching her mother's reaction. "And you're here? Doesn't that mean something?" Her mother let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe it's just life's cruel way of forcing me to face the things I tried to bury." She leaned forward, pressing her fingers against her forehead, and Olivia wanted to say something, wanted to offer comfort, but she didn't know how. All she knew was that despite everything, despite the pain, despite the past, her mother was still here, still fighting, still holding on even if she didn't know why. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The sound of footsteps made them both look up. A doctor approaching with a clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable, and in that instant, Olivia felt her mother tense beside her, like she was bracing herself for whatever came next. And Olivia realized, as the doctor opened his mouth to speak, that no matter what happened now, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The doctor's voice was steady, clinical, but Olivia barely heard the words, only catching fragments. Critical condition, extensive damage, touch and go, each phrase slicing through the air like a blade. Her mother's breath hitched beside her, fingers curling into tight fists against her lap. And for the first time, Olivia saw it, the fear, the kind that stripped away everything else, leaving only raw, unfiltered emotion. And she realized then that for all her mother's walls, all her silence, all her careful detachment, this moment terrified her. Olivia's chest tightened. She wanted to reach out, wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of it all settled too heavily in her throat. The doctor kept talking, explaining options, procedures, but the words felt distant, like they were meant for someone else, not them, because none of it felt real. None of it felt like it could be happening. But then the doctor sighed, nodded once, and walked away, leaving them in silence once more. Olivia turned to her mother, expecting her to say something, to move, to react, but she just sat there, unmoving, staring ahead with an emptiness that unsettled Olivia more than anything. And then, after what felt like an eternity, her mother finally exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath. "I should have been there," she whispered, barely audible. "I should have been there when she needed me." Olivia frowned, because she had spent years believing her mother didn't feel regret, didn't dwell on the past, but now, hearing those words, she realized just how wrong she had been. "You're here now," she said quietly, unsure if it was the right thing to say, unsure if it even mattered, but her mother just let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Too late," she murmured. "It's always too late." Olivia clenched her fists, because she didn't want to believe that, didn't want to believe that time had already run out, that nothing could be salvaged. But before she could speak, before she could argue, a nurse appeared, asking if they wanted to see her. The question sent a jolt through Olivia's mother, something shifting in her posture, like she had been preparing for this moment and dreading it all at once. She stood slowly, as if the very act of moving took all the energy she had left. Olivia followed, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. And when they stepped into the dimly lit hospital room, she saw her, the woman who had been the cause of all this pain, lying motionless in the hospital bed, tubes and wires attached to her fragile frame, her face pale, almost unrecognizable. And for a long moment, Olivia's mother just stood there, staring, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the person she had known. Olivia hesitated before stepping forward, watching her mother's expression shift, something breaking in her eyes, something Olivia had never seen before. And then, finally, her mother moved closer, reaching out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the woman's hand. And in that moment, Olivia realized that whatever had happened before, whatever pain had existed between them, this was the moment that would define them, the moment where everything could change, where nothing at all, the moment where they had to decide whether the past would continue to haunt them, or if they could find a way to move forward. But Olivia didn't know the answer. Didn't know if her mother would ever be able to let go of her guilt, if this woman in the hospital bed would ever wake up and give them the chance to fix what had been broken. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she saw her mother as something more than the distant, hardened woman she had always known. She saw her as someone trying, someone afraid, someone desperate for another chance. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Olivia watched as her mother's fingers lingered on the fragile hand of the woman lying unconscious in the hospital bed, her grip hesitant, unsure, as if touching her too firmly might shatter what little remained. And Olivia had never seen her mother like this, had never seen her hesitate, had never seen her crumble beneath the weight of emotion. And yet here she was, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line, shoulders drawn tight as if she were holding back something too powerful to be contained. Olivia didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should say anything at all, because for years, words had been weapons between them, sharp-edged and brutal, leaving wounds that never seemed to heal. But now words felt useless, unnecessary, because the silence between them said more than any argument ever could. Olivia swallowed hard, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her own breath uneven as she took in the sight of the woman before them, pale skin, dark bruises blooming along her arms, a breathing tube in place, the rhythmic beep of the monitors the only sign that she was still alive. Olivia didn't even know if she was supposed to feel anything for her, this woman, this stranger who had been nothing more than a ghost in the stories her mother never wanted to tell. But now, here she was, and the past had suddenly become real, something they couldn't outrun, something they couldn't ignore. Olivia looked at her mother again, at the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, at the way her fingers curled tighter around the woman's hand, and Olivia wondered if this was regret, if this was guilt, if this was the moment her mother had been running from all her life. And for the first time, Olivia felt something crack in her own chest, something she had buried deep, something she thought had died a long time ago, because seeing her mother like this, so exposed, so human, made her realize that maybe she had never truly understood her, maybe she had never tried, and that thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The steady beeping of the machines filled the room, too loud in the silence, too slow, too steady, as if time itself had stretched and distorted around them. Olivia didn't know how long they stood there, didn't know if minutes had passed or hours, but eventually, her mother let out a breath, long and shaky. And when she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, almost broken. "I never thought I'd see her again," she murmured, almost to herself, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Olivia's throat tightened, because she knew what she was really saying. She knew this moment wasn't just about the woman in the bed, it was about them, about all the years they had spent fighting, avoiding, pretending. Olivia shifted, her hands clenched at her sides, wanting to say something, wanting to reach for her, but not knowing how. Her mother took another breath, deeper this time, steadier, her fingers finally loosening their grip. "I don't know if she'll wake up," she admitted, her voice softer now, more vulnerable than Olivia had ever heard it. "But if she does, I don't know what to say to her." Olivia's chest ached, because she understood that feeling too well, because she had spent her whole life feeling that way about her own mother. She took a step forward before she could second-guess herself, hesitated for only a moment, then slowly reached out, her fingers brushing against her mother's hand, and for the first time in years, her mother didn't pull away, didn't retreat behind that wall she had built so carefully. She just stood there letting Olivia's touch ground her, and in that moment, Olivia realized that maybe they didn't need to have the right words, maybe they didn't need to fix everything at once, maybe just being here, just facing this together, was enough. The beeping of the monitors continued, steady and unchanging, the air thick with everything unspoken, and for the first time, Olivia didn't feel like running. She didn't feel like she had to fight. She just stood there, waiting, breathing, hoping. Olivia stood there, the weight of her mother's hand in hers grounding her, yet the heaviness in her chest refused to lift. The sterile scent of antiseptic in the room made her feel nauseous, and the beeping of the machines grew louder in her ears, drowning out everything else. But she refused to look away from her mother's face, the quiet desperation there almost too much to bear. She had never seen her mother this way before, so broken, so small, and Olivia didn't know how to handle it, didn't know how to make it better, didn't know how to bridge the gap of years of resentment, of silence, of the years that had been wasted in their fractured relationship. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, and instead, she just stood there, trying to swallow the lump of regret that had formed inside her. The woman in the bed, the woman who had been nothing but a name in their past, a woman whose absence had shaped their lives in ways neither of them wanted to admit, now lay before them, her life hanging by a thread. Olivia couldn't quite reconcile the image of the woman she had only heard about, the figure that her mother had always kept hidden away, with the frail body in the bed, and for a moment, she wondered if this was real, if this was really happening, or if it was just some kind of nightmare. Her mother's hand trembled slightly in hers, and Olivia squeezed it tighter, as if that small act could somehow provide the comfort they both needed, but it didn't. They were still here, stuck in this moment, caught between the past and the present, between the things they couldn't change and the things they didn't know how to face. The soft rustling of the hospital sheets filled the silence as the woman's breathing changed, a slight hitch in her chest, and Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Her mother flinched but didn't pull away, didn't move, just stared, her face pale as she watched the rise and fall of the woman's chest with bated breath. Olivia couldn't help but feel the same dread creep up on her, the same fear that something was about to happen, that they were about to be caught in something neither of them could escape. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating, and Olivia realized how much had been left unsaid between them, how many years of bitterness and unresolved feelings had been allowed to fester in the shadows. She wanted to ask her mother so many things. Why hadn't she ever told her the truth about this woman? Why had she kept her at arm's length, always so distant, so guarded? But the questions died on her lips, and instead, she just stood there, watching her mother's face, the raw emotion she couldn't hide anymore. Olivia wondered if it was too late to fix anything, if they would ever have the time they needed to heal, or if this moment, this fragile moment, was all they would ever have. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, and Olivia felt a strange sense of finality in the air, as if everything was about to change in an instant, as if this woman's breath, this fragile life, was the key to unlocking everything that had been left unresolved. Her mother's eyes were still locked on the woman in the bed, but Olivia could see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, could see the way her mother's lips trembled slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. It was the same way Olivia felt. There was so much to say, so much to ask, so much to fix, but neither of them knew where to begin. For a moment, they were two strangers standing in a room full of ghosts, caught in the echo of a history that neither of them had fully understood. Olivia squeezed her mother's hand again, feeling the warmth of her skin, the unspoken connection that still lingered between them, and without thinking, she whispered, "It's not too late, Mom. We can fix this." Her mother's eyes flickered to hers, and for a brief second, Olivia thought she saw something shift, something fragile, something hopeful. But then it was gone, replaced by the same unreadable expression that had always been there. Olivia wasn't sure if her mother had heard her, or if she had just said it because she needed to hear it herself. But it didn't matter. They were still standing here, still facing the unknown, still unsure of what the future held, and for the first time, Olivia didn't feel the need to run. She just stood there, in the stillness of the room, trying to breathe, trying to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different, something better. As Olivia stood there, hands still gripping her mother's, the reality of the moment settled in, heavy and thick. The beeping of the machines, the rhythmic rise and fall of the woman's chest, the sterile, cold atmosphere of the hospital room, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had paused, unwilling to move forward, unsure of what the next moment would bring. Olivia glanced at her mother, whose face was now pale, tired, eyes rimmed with red, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the weight of everything in her mother's expression, the regrets, the lost years, the unspoken words that neither of them had dared to say. Olivia wanted to speak, to break the silence that had stretched so painfully between them for years, but the words felt too big, too overwhelming, like an ocean she couldn't swim across. She wished she could turn back time, wished she could go back to a place before the walls had been built between them, before everything had spiraled out of control. But here they were, standing at the edge of something neither of them was ready to face, and yet both of them knew it had to be done. The soft clicking of the machines was the only sound in the room, filling the space where words should have been, and Olivia felt a chill run through her as the woman in the bed stirred again, her eyes fluttering open, but only for a moment, as if she was holding on to something that wasn't there. Her mother tensed, her fingers tightening around Olivia's, but she said nothing. They were trapped in this moment, in this fragile, tentative space between the past and whatever future was waiting for them, and neither of them knew how to step forward. Olivia glanced at her mother again, her heart heavy, knowing that the silence between them wasn't just about what had happened in the past. It was about everything they had failed to say, about the broken pieces of their relationship that they couldn't put back together. She wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the quiet was all that was left. The woman in the bedside, a weak, fragile sound, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how much longer the woman had, no idea if they were standing at the edge of a goodbye or a beginning. Her heart ached, the pain of everything unspoken, everything undone, crashing over her in waves. Her mother's grip on her hand loosened slightly, and Olivia felt a flicker of something that could have been hope or just the lingering desire to make things right. But as the woman in the bed let out another shallow breath, Olivia couldn't help but feel a deep, sinking dread in her chest, the fear that they might never get the chance to fix what was broken, to repair the damage. She didn't want to lose this moment. She didn't want to leave with regrets. With a shaky breath, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile but determined. "We can still make it right, can't we? There's still time." Her mother didn't respond right away, but Olivia saw the shift in her eyes, the faintest glimmer of something between them, something tentative but real. And for a moment, Olivia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could still find a way to heal. The woman's chest rose one last time, and Olivia's breath caught, the world holding its breath as if waiting for something. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment neither of them could undo or escape. Olivia squeezed her mother's hand, a silent promise to keep fighting, to keep trying, no matter how difficult it felt. She didn't know if they could truly fix everything that had been broken between them, but she would never stop trying. And for the first time in years, she believed that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. As Olivia sat there, still holding her mother's hand, the sterile, quiet atmosphere of the hospital room grew even heavier, the ticking of the clock on the wall marking each passing second with an almost unbearable slowness. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of everything, of the years lost, the words unsaid, the promises broken, pressing down on her. She wanted so badly to believe that they could still fix things, that they could bridge the gap that had grown between them over time. But the silence in the room felt like a wall, keeping them from what they both so desperately needed. Her mother's shallow breaths echoed in the stillness, and Olivia felt a rising panic in her chest, a fear that if she didn't act now, she would never have the chance to make things right. She glanced at the machines beside the bed, their beeps and whirs punctuating the quiet, and wondered, with a sinking heart, how much longer her mother had. The thought of losing her, of never getting the chance to speak the words that had been trapped inside her for so long, felt unbearable. She squeezed her mother's hand tighter, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant for things to get this way. I didn't want to lose you." There was no immediate response, just the sound of her mother's labored breathing, but Olivia didn't pull away. She stayed there, waiting, hoping, praying that her mother could hear her, that somehow they could still find a way back to each other. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity, and Olivia could feel the weight of the moment sinking in, knowing that there was no going back. She would have given anything to undo the hurt, to take back the fights, the misunderstandings, the times she had felt so alone. But she couldn't. All she had now was this moment, this fragile thread of connection between them, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, her mother could feel it too. And then, as if in response to her unspoken plea, her mother's fingers shifted ever so slightly, a faint squeeze against Olivia's hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Olivia's heart skip a beat. She looked at her mother's face, at the frail expression softened with something she hadn't seen in years, vulnerability, the kind that spoke of years of regret, of longing for reconciliation, of a desire to make things right before it was too late. Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she leaned closer, pressing her forehead gently against her mother's. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, the words barely audible, but full of everything she had kept hidden for so long. Her mother's eyelids fluttered, her lips moving in an almost imperceptible motion, and for a moment, Olivia held her breath, afraid that the moment would slip away before she could even fully grasp it. But then, ever so faintly, her mother's voice broke through, a whisper, barely there but undeniable. "I love you too, Olivia." The words were simple, but they carried with them a lifetime of emotion, of everything they had been through and everything they had yet to say. Olivia's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow, her chest tight as she allowed herself to feel the weight of those words, knowing that they didn't erase everything, but they were the first step toward healing. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope flicker in the darkness. She didn't know what the future would bring, or how much longer they would have, but in this moment, in this fragile, fleeting moment, they had found each other again. And that, at least, was enough. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey. Elon Musk is changing the world with Tesla and SpaceX. Bill Gates built Microsoft. Steve Jobs created Apple. Nikola Tesla invented crazy technology. Albert Einstein discovered the theory of relativity. Leonardo da Vinci painted, invented, and was a genius. William Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. Madonna became the queen of pop. Charlie Chaplin made the world laugh. Stephen Hawking revealed the secrets of the universe. Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook. Oprah Winfrey became the face of TV. Jeff Bezos made Amazon. Conor McGregor fights and speaks loudly.